People love to argue about where the lines are, what's a super robot, what's a real robot, what actually distinguishes them. I've seen a million different suggestions proposed for how you can tell them apart. And it's mostly vibes. It's vibes.
Well...
Hello, and welcome back to Gateway to Anime. How are you all? What's going on? We are the podcast where we throw open the gates to anime, where we bring you the best new anime, as well as deep dive into the classics. Ever wanted to get into anime but didn't know where to start? We are the podcast for you. I am your host, Sam. Charlie, how are you today?
I'm good. I'm really excited because today we've got some very special guests.
We do.
And we're talking about something that I really would love to be able to dive deeper into. You know, I say this is like we are the deep dive anime podcast, but obviously there are some areas in our podcasting game that we're not like as across as others. And this particular topic is something that I really would love to get my teeth into, my claws into, into. So I'm excited today to be interviewing some people who really are the true experts on this.
Yes, this is very exciting. So, as I said before, we deep dive into the classics, and there is almost none more classic than Mobile Suit Gundam, and we have with us Nina and Thom from Mobile Suit Breakdown. Excellent name for a podcast, and an excellent podcast. Please check it out after this if you want to get more into Mobile Suit Gundam. These are the people for you. Nina and Thom, thank you so much for joining us from New York City.
Thank you for having us and for all of those very nice things you said about us.
Before we go any further, Sam, I'd just like to say a quick shout out to today's episode sponsor, Hobbyco. We'll have more on them later.
So, as Charlie was saying, a big problem I've had with the whole Mobile Suit world is that, well, I just never got into it, right? I missed it. A bit like One Piece, you know, the other big hole and shame, great deep shame that I carry with me every day of my life is that I haven't watched all of One Piece. And, you know, it's because I missed it. And it's so intimidating. It started in, 1979?
That's right.
And it's such a world, but it's one of those things which I feel like people know about Gundam without actually knowing necessarily what Gundam is. So I find that really interesting because it somehow has this huge pop cultural footprint. But I actually probably don't know that many people who've ever watched it. In fact, a good guest of ours who comes on the show a lot, Alex Williams, we have a little anime chat with a bunch of sort of guests on this show, and he was like, I'm getting into Gundam. And we're like, cool, let us know. We're about to do a podcast about it. And then this morning we were like, hey, how you going with Gundam, man? He's like, gave up, had no idea where to start. I was so lost. And I was like, well, now he has a podcast he can listen to get back on track.
Exactly.
But how did you both find Gundam? How did it come to you? Was it early? Was it late? Or was it something? Yeah. What's your Gundam journey?
Well, this is actually the story of how our podcast got started, really, because I really hadn't watched any Gundam until I met Thom, who is a lifelong Gundam fan. When did you first start watching it?
Oh, gosh. I guess probably I was 12 or 13. Wow. I got hooked on giant robot animation real early with the Transformers, the original Generation 1 Transformers show. And, you know, back in the day, you used to get VHS tapes out of the library or from the rental shop, and they would come with these things called trailers on the beginning. I don't know if people nowadays know about trailers on VHS tapes, but you would see, especially back in the day, you would see all kinds of anime trailers that really maybe weren't quite appropriate for the level of thing that you were actually trying to watch. So you might be watching a Transformers cartoon show for elementary school students, and you'd get some pretty hardcore anime trailers for that. But the one that made my mind explode was Gundam 0083 Stardust Memory, which was a direct-to-video, really, really high production values, just gorgeously animated show from the early 90s. And it would be maybe a decade before I'd actually get to see it, but I watched that trailer over and over again.
And then after you eventually tracked down years later, was that the first one you watched, or did you find others in between that?
No, like most people of my generation, I actually started with Gundam Wing, which was on TV here in the States. I didn't actually get to watch it on TV, but I would watch some of the VHS tapes that were released around that. And so I got little disjointed pieces of the story. That's another one I wouldn't be able to watch properly until many years later. And I'm sort of foreshadowing our discussion about where the right entry point to Gundam is with this, but we'll talk about that, I think, in good time. Around the 40th anniversary, which was back in 2019, I said to Nina, hey, I've watched a lot of Gundam, but I've never watched it in order. Would you be willing to watch all of this 40-year-old anime show with me? And calling it a 40-year-old anime show kind of undersells it because they more or less have not stopped releasing new Gundam in that time. So Nina said to me,
okay, but we have to make some kind of a project out of it. If we're going to do this, we need to do something with it. That is a lot of anime to watch. And I think I was thinking of blogs like Julia and Julia about the woman who cooked her way through Julia Child's whole cookbook, things like that, and thought, well, maybe we could do a blog or a podcast. And once we started watching it together, I realized there was a lot to talk about there. And the podcast was born.
That's so cool. That's so cool. So I guess I want to ask a question about why is Gundam such a huge success? So what do you think resonates with the audience compared to others, especially in the late 70s, early 80s? There was quite a few others around that period of time, Mazinger Z and these sorts of things. But how did it stand out from other mecha at the time and or sci-fi shows? And what made it different? And why do you think it has the staying power that it has?
It's kind of funny because that initial run was actually canceled. It was underperforming based on what the studio and the various sponsors wanted. And it wasn't until a bit later that it really sort of picked up steam and gained the popularity that it has now. And some of that was fan involvement, especially from women fans. The initial creator of Gundam, Yoshiyuki Tomino, has talked about all of these young women writing letters to the studio, writing letters to the creators, organizing early fan events and cosplay events. It's sort of similar to Star Trek in that way, that women fans really spearheaded the fan community organizing around it. But in terms of what seems to most grab people in it, they do a really great job of dramatic storytelling. They have really complex and compelling characters. Although it's certainly dated by today's standards, the first run of the show and the movies have a lot of really beautiful sections of animation. They have a lot of goofy bits as well and sort of funny errors, but some very impressive work for the time and a great theme song, which can't be discounted.
And part of the reason it eventually took off actually has to do with why it failed in the first place. The sponsor for that first TV show was a toy company called Clover, and they were manufacturing toys, action figures meant for the elementary school market. And the show was not really made for kids that young. The show took off with teenagers and older people, young adults. And a big part of the reason why it did that is because it took a more, it's silly to say this about a giant robot show, but a more realistic approach. More nuanced, more complex characters, and a more realistic attitude towards war. And that really did appeal to the teenagers and to those young adults, and they didn't go out and buy toys. So from the perspective of the sponsors, it was a huge failure. But another rival toy company, Bandai, which people may have heard of, which at the time was not nearly the juggernaut it is now, Bandai saw this market of teenagers and young adults, and they said, well, they don't want toys to play with, but they like model kits. And so Bandai then started making and selling Gundam model kits, or Gundam plastic model kits, Gunpla. And these took off like gangbusters. They were like, this was a craze. This was the Tickle Me Elmo of that generation. To the point where there were like near riots at toy stores when these would go on sale. And if you're a company and you have a product that takes off like that, you're going to want to follow up on that. So with Bandai's support, they would re-release the TV show as a series of 3 movies that had been sort of taken, cut the show apart, put it back together into movie form, and also maybe go through and fix a few of those animation goofs. One of the things that happened during the production of it is that the lead artist worked himself so hard that he wound up in the hospital. And so the last, 10, 12 episodes of the show are not as well drawn as they could have been. Those all get remade for the movies. The movies do fantastically at the box office. Tons of money is pouring in. The Gunpla is selling, and it would continue selling for years after that.
Is there sort of a gap between Gunpla fans and Gundam fans? Are they always crossed over, or is there something like, are there those who just want to build Gunpla, and don't really watch the show? Or do you find there's a big divide between those fandoms, or is it all kind of quite homogenous?
I had initially thought that most of the people who are Gunpla fans are also fans of the show, though there are plenty of people who are into the show who are not really into the model kits as much. But I know Thom has a different perspective on this.
I mean, I've known a lot of people who liked the model kits but didn't really watch the show, and partly that's just a question of availability. A lot of Gundam anime has not actually been accessible in English until fairly recently, whereas the model kits have always been available. You can go back to like the mid-1980s. There's a photograph of the woman who designed the iconic original like Apple II icons. There's a photo of her in her office lounging at her desk. And if you zoom in the upper right-hand corner of that photo, you can see some Gunpla sitting on the shelf there. Even in the mid-80s, you could get it in the States. So yeah, there's a lot of people who love the robots and don't really care about the show they come from.
Forgive me for my total ignorance around Gunpla, but from my kind of knowledge of it, is it that a lot of the reason why it was also incredibly successful is because it was kind of like being able to make these figures but without having to use glue? Like it's all kind of clicked together. Was that kind of like a new technology thing for that in terms of model making?
You're basically correct, except you're wrong in the one specific that the original model kits, the ones that took off, the ones that started the craze, those still required glue. But a lot of the model kit technology gets developed as Gunpla goes along. Because it's so successful, Bandai keeps putting more money into the research, the technology development, and then new technological upgrades tend to coincide with new TV shows coming out. If you've ever built a Gunpla model kit, a lot of the joints are held together by these sort of like soft rubber, what we call polycaps. Mm-hmm. Polycaps were first deployed by Bandai in 1985, coinciding with Zeta Gundam.
It's a really good business model, isn't it? You know, should take some notes.
It's so clever.
It's been working for them.
And on the topic of Gunpla, I think now's a good time to mention this episode's sponsor, which is very fittingly Hobbyco. Hobbyco have a specialised Gundam section on their website to help you explore the Gunpla hobby. You can browse by grade or by series. And if you're new to the hobby, they have entry-level kits and all the tools you need to get started. The range of Gunpla at Hobbyco is massive, with iconic kits from every series. Hobbyco is your home base for Gunpla in Australia. Head into the store or browse online for all your Gundam needs. Thanks again for Hobbyco for sponsoring this episode. Let's get back into it, and you can check out the link in the bio.
So relating to the mecha genre as a whole, like how much of an impact did Gundam have on mecha as a genre? So I mean, especially the robot designs, and I guess as you said before, the more realistic, and there's that whole concept of real robot versus the super robot. From my very, very basic research into this, I sort of found that Gundam appears to be kind of the first of the real robot genre. And I mean, from what I understand as well, that those terms are actually a bit more nebulous and sort of, they're not as easy to hard delineate between the two. There's a lot of crossover between super and real.
Absolutely.
But do you want to just have a talk about that and first of all, what that is for people who don't know, and also how important was Gundam in creating the real robot subgenre of mecha?
Absolutely foundational as far as establishing that as a genre. I mean, you can probably argue that maybe there were forerunners before Gundam that were sort of going in that direction, but Gundam sets the stage for everything Real Robot that follows. Most of the landmark Real Robot shows from the 80s, shows like Fang of the Sung Dogram, Armored Trooper Vatams, these are Gundam imitators. These are Gundam followers. They are trying to recapture what Gundam was able to accomplish. And you're right, absolutely. People love to argue about where the lines are, what's a super robot, what's a real robot, what actually distinguishes them. I've seen a million different suggestions proposed for how you can tell them apart. And it's mostly vibes. It's vibes.
Well, but you can certainly say if the robot is alive, that's a super robot.
I could argue with you about that. What I would say, my definition, which is exclusive to me and so no one can get mad at me about it, is if it's piloted by a hero, it's a super robot. If it's piloted by a soldier, it's a real robot. And now we can argue about who's a hero and who's a soldier.
One sort of fascinating tidbit about this is that the original creator of Gundam, Tomino, he worked at Mushi Productions, and so he worked on Astro Boy, a particularly famous super robot show, for a long time early in his career before starting Gundam.
I'm learning a lot, and I'm excited by this thing.
Because obviously you get, the real robot. I think that's a really good distinction, actually, because, generally, like, from my basic understanding of it is, if it's a weapon of the military, real robot. If it's sort of if it's sentient or if it's like magical in some capacity, super robot. But as I said, there's so many things like, what's Neon Genesis Evangelion? Kind of both. You know, it's like, this so interesting to delineate those definitions.
Is Shinji a hero? You know, that's
Shinji a hero.
The question.
But yeah, that stuff really, really fascinates me, because also Mazinger Z, I think, was kind of in 72, I think, had the first physically piloted robot in Animanga, because before that it was Tetsujin 28, which had a remote controlled robot, again by like a 15-year-old kid, which is, they're often piloted by teenagers. But Macross is another really interesting one, because that really feels to me like that's super robot, but also something which was, I think, actually made as a bit of a joke towards Gundam, from what I can understand. It was like sort of more of a comedic element and kind of slightly taking the piss till it took its own, it made its own way, you know. But obviously music is the key delineating point between, well, what sets Macross apart from something like Gundam is that music's such a massive theme, to the point where in 94, Shinichiro Watanabe made Macross Plus with Yoko Kanno, and actually an Idol, I need to watch Macross Plus because it sounds wild. Like Idol anime / mecha, I'm like, well, sign me up. Madness.
Is there anything that idols can't do according to anime? Some of them are zombies, you know?
Have either of you watched Macross?
A little bit, yeah. I was actually going to say, since you were talking about Macross Plus is largely made by staff members who worked on a Gundam show just a year prior and borrows a few plot elements. It's sort of a second go-around at the same thing. There is definitely in those early years a strong sense of rivalry between Gundam and Macross, but really the industry is so small that everybody works on everything.
That's one of the ways that I feel like Gundam has become so influential, is it really becomes a training ground for a whole lot of animators who then go on to make their own works. I mentioned Evangelion earlier. Anno Hideaki worked on a Gundam show.
A movie, actually.
Or one of the movies. Okay. Itano, I don't know if you guys know the term Itano Circus. It's a name for a particular kind of scene, usually in a mecha anime, though it can crop up in other ones, where you sort of have a sense of moving through a whole bunch of spiraling explosives and missiles and things. You feel like you are in the midst of all of this weaponry and explosions and things, and they're sort of all moving around you. It's very frenetic, gives a great sense of chaos and movement. And Itano, long before this started being named for him, was storyboarding it out and animating this particular kind of scene for Gundam.
I can know exactly what that is as well. I can picture the...
And the other one, this one is kind of silly, but points to some of Gundam's influence. If you have ever been reading a manga, watching a live-action Japanese show, or watching another anime, and a character has said something along the lines of, "You hit me. My own father never hit me." That is a Gundam reference. And it crops up in Revolutionary Girl Utena, in Tokyo Godfathers, in Sakura Wars, in Spy Family. Just all over the place, from people who either grew up watching Gundam or worked on Gundam or just were so influenced by that scene from the original show that they include little nods to it in other programs.
Yeah, its influence really is massive, isn't it? And so my one real experience with Gundam, there's a wonderful company in Australia here called Sugoi-Co, who do bring in a lot of animes and whatnot, a very, very cool company who do a bit of work with. And they brought out Mobile Suit Gundam Seed just last year, year before maybe? No, last year. And I went to it, and having zero knowledge of Gundam whatsoever, I have never been more confused in any context in my life. And like the whole audience were all laughing, and like, you know, character like, oh, such a X character's name thing to do, and everyone, I was just like, yeah, I guess, like, what's it's just one of those things which I could feel being part of such an active and fervent audience, but like having no clue what was going on. So in service of that, say I want to get into Gundam, okay, and I don't want to go back and start from 1979 and watch 40 years worth of content. What is the best gateway into Gundam?
Well, there are 3 schools of thought, and the first one is you should just go back to 1979 and watch 40 years of anime. The second school of thought is actually very similar to that, but you start in a different place and you go in a different order, but you still watch all 40 years. My personal recommendation, Gundam fans love to argue about this question. If you are in group of Gundam fans, if you find yourself at a theater showing a different Gundam movie and they're all talking about something you couldn't care less about and you would like to distract them, just lob this question into the middle and watch them fight. But the thing is, basically nobody having this argument started in the place that they say you should. If somebody says start at the beginning, 99% chance they did not start at the beginning. Gundam fans start all over the place. You start with whatever happens to cross your plate the first time, whatever looks interesting. And so my recommendation, if you are thinking about getting into Gundam, is to watch anything that looks interesting to you. Especially in the last 20 years, most of what has been made for Gundam has been made for a hypothetical new audience. Starting in the mid-90s, they start making alternate universe series. And so every one of these is its own timeline, its own characters, its own plot. And usually it's all contained within one or two shows in a movie.
I have a slightly different recommendation. I often tell people to start with the first Gundam series, not necessarily with the goal of watching all of it, just that I think it is a great series and well worth watching. But we have had some friends bounce off of it pretty hard just because of the older animation. And in that case, I'm with Thom on picking some more recent series, especially the ones that don't take place in the sort of main, what's called the Universal Century timeline. Mm-hmm. Something that's more standalone. There's also just so much Gundam that, sort of like with anime generally, depending on what you like, you can probably find something that aligns more with that. Do you want something more lighthearted, more serious, strange, dramatic?
And just to throw a few names out there to help people who don't really want to do a ton of research about this, if you want sort of goofy shonen battle action, G Gundam is a great place to start. If you have a lot of nostalgia for the 90s, Gundam Wing is a good place. If you are wanting something a little more recent, Gundam the Witch from Mercury is very good. So is Gundam Iron-Blooded Orphans. Gundam Unicorn is a bit of a controversial recommendation here. It's very well loved, it's very well done, it's very well animated, and it's fairly recent. It is part of that larger Universal Century storyline, and it's fairly far along in it, but it's definitely made in a way that you can appreciate it even if you don't get all of the references. And then you can watch 40 years of anime and come back and get all the references.
I think it's a really strong point towards the series and just how it's evolved in the years that, like, you're so right, because a lot of them are standalone in themselves and that you can kind of, like, you don't have to watch from the start to get, like, a chronological story. But, like, yeah, I think it's really great that, and it's a great recommendation just to be like, what interests you? This is such a vast thing. So just find, like, that genre that you like and then watch that kind of coinciding series. I think that's actually, that's giving me, like, more of a chance to get into Gundam, I feel, than being like, you have to start from one to get anything.
Oh, yeah.
Like, yeah. I've watched Mercury and I've watched the Iron-Blooded Orphans before, and I like both of those series a lot. The reason I like Mercury Witch is because it reminded me a lot of Revolutionary Girl Utena, and so that's one of my favourite shows. So when I heard that there were similarities, I went towards that, and I thought it was a fantastic series. And I do think being a more, like, modern show in terms of, like, accessibility for newer fans who are used to a modern animation style, it's a good place, I would say.
And they've also just been much more proactive about bringing out Blu-rays and DVDs of the more recent shows for the international market, whereas some of the older things have been very difficult to get until recently, and some stuff you can still only get as imports. And
yeah.
And how has, I suppose you guys have obviously now watched this from pretty much start to finish how has the show evolved over the years? What are the major things you've seen compared to, I mean, obviously there's a natural progression with animation, of course, but thematically, is it still kind of similar to 1979, or is it completely evolved in that respect?
Well, I actually haven't seen very much of the recent stuff. I've seen the first season of Iron-Blooded Orphans, a few episodes of Witch from Mercury, and one part of Unicorn. But other than that, I have been watching chronologically, and we're currently on Victory Gundam, which is 1992.
93.
Sorry, 93. So I can only speak to 79 to 93, really, but I had a professor in university who, this was for a film class, and said that American Westerns are always about when they're made, not about the time they're set in. And in addition to the sort of business side of Gundam trying to keep up with contemporary tastes because they want to always be attracting new fans, often newer Gundam series are reflecting on sort of issues of the day. And that may change in the later series, I'm not sure. But as we've noted, sort of moving through the older stuff, the first Gundam show, a lot of it is about Tomino reflecting on his experience as a young child during World War II. By the time we get to the early 90s, it's heavily influenced by some of the wars in the Balkans at that time.
Skipping forward a few decades, you can really distinctly see in the early 2000s, oh, this one is about 9/11. Oh, this one is about the global war on terror. They're very responsive to the times in which they're being made.
I mean, the whole mecha genre, right, is so interesting and relatively unique to Japan. And a lot of that is obviously a response to World War II and the technological advancement of Japan from the Meiji Restoration and how fast they modernized. And of course, a lot of Miyazaki's work for Studio Ghibli is, of course, that tension between modernity and its past, and it's rather sort of, the Shinto sort of believes, the connection to the land and whatnot. Mm-hmm. I mean, Gundam really seems to be tapping into that kind of tension between, especially in respect to the war machines, it really seems to tap into that. Is that relatively correct, or is that way off base?
I see Gundam as being much more preoccupied with how war affects children, how there's really no protecting children from it. If it's happening, it's going to involve them in some way. And what kind of forces drive children to become violent participants, whether it's protecting their own home, whether it's standing up to like a fascistic police force, or even working for their family's survival. The kinds of circumstances that push children to violence, basically, to take up arms.
Mm-hmm. Also, with the environmental aspect specifically and the tension between environmentalism and mechanization, the whole Universal Century timeline takes place essentially after an environmental collapse so bad that the Earth had to be almost abandoned. Most of the human population is out in these space colonies orbiting the Earth, and the reason for that is because Earth was so polluted and so overpopulated that the only option was for people to leave. And most of the larger, most of the wars, most of the larger social questions, the tension that causes all of the events that lead to those children needing to take those extraordinary actions are the result of people fighting over scarce resources. People who want to go back to Earth but aren't allowed to. People who think we need to leave Earth behind in order to evolve and become the next stage of our species.
And that's why I find the mecha genre in general so fascinating and so, I mean, you say it's a small industry, but the mecha medium is just so massive. And yeah, this really is the one, isn't it? I mean, Macross, yes, but doesn't quite have the same fandom in the West. But I think in Japan, much larger fandom for Macross. But Gundam, and yeah, the Gunpla thing is also just, it's so smart. It's so clever. It's like,
I know what's up.
Tick, 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 tick.
Just want to really ask, because obviously there's been some massive news in the Gundam community and fandom, is that we've got a live-action Gundam, which then paired with Legendary Pictures, which is a Hollywood production company, so co-production, and I would just love to hear your thoughts on that.
Oh, I'm not holding my breath for it actually happening. We've heard this line before.
I'll believe it when it happens. I'll believe it when I see a real trailer.
That one teaser poster wasn't exactly...
Yeah, we've done this dance before. Actually, the first attempt to make a Hollywood Gundam was all the way back in 1983, and it obviously didn't happen. But it went as far as having a script written and concept art being made and that kind of thing. Sid Mead, who was the designer for Blade Runner, was attached to it at that point. And it didn't go anywhere. There have been other attempts since then, and this current one has been sort of moving from one writer and director to another for a little while now.
Yeah, seems to be stuck in pre-production hell.
I will say this for them, though. The company Bandai does seem truly committed to making this happen.
It's interesting because obviously anime live actions have always been a gamble. I think we can say there's been, in terms of Hollywood, how they have done them. So you're looking at Dragon Ball Evolution, which was a total disaster. But recently there have been some successes financially. So we've got One Piece live action, which was, so maybe that means that there's probably more of a push and they're kind of seeing the success of other live action anime adaptations. So maybe it will happen this time. I don't know. But yeah, as you said, you've probably been burnt before with that. Is there a particular, if you were to pitch your ideal version of a Hollywood movie of Gundam, is there a particular series that you think you would borrow anything from that you think would work for a live-action film?
All right, so there's one called 0080 War in the Pocket. It's 6 episodes long, so it's actually about the length of a movie already. And it's the story of a little boy who is just living on a neutral colony when his colony gets attacked by enemy raiders. They're in the middle of a war, but they're not part of it. Their colony is neutral. Except that the Federation government, the main Earth government, has put a secret Gundam development facility on this colony. And so these commandos from the enemy faction, from the Principality of Zeon, are trying to break in and destroy this Gundam before it can be completed and brought to join the war. And so it's pretty small scale. It's pretty low stakes. The characters are mostly just ordinary people. Ordinary soldiers, ordinary people living on the colony. And it's just a really beautiful little small scale story.
Tragic.
Okay, yes, also tragic. And I think that would work really well.
It sounds like it would work really well, actually, because it's the kind of introduction and not too obviously a lot of Gundam is, got a lot of lore to cover and things, and I feel like a movie would be hard to get everything. You imagine if you did I'm Blooded Orphans, it would be too hard, or Wing, to get into just a movie. So that sounds like a great shout, honestly.
I want to ask, after being, well, Tom, especially you being a Gundam fan, a lifelong Gundam fan, essentially, and Nina as a more of a newcomer to it, what is it that you both individually, what do you love most about this franchise, and why has it captured you and kept your attention for so long, Tom? And Nina, why are you now, I don't know if you are a huge fan of it now, but have you become a huge fan through this rewatch?
I have definitely become a fan. Sometimes it's wonderful, sometimes it's terrible, but it's almost never boring.
Yeah, good episode, bad episode, mediocre episode. By the end of it, we always have at least an hour of stuff to talk about with each other. And there aren't a lot of shows like that out there.
And then the other one for me is there's one of the running jokes about Gundam and about mecha shows sort of more broadly is that regardless of what kind of messaging or themes they have, people will get distracted by the aesthetics, the wow, cool robot factor, which didn't interest me at all when I first started watching the show. I wasn't really interested in the way that the mecha were designed, drawn, animated. But the sheer quality and creativity of a lot of the designs and animation have won me over. There are some designs that the first time they show up on screen, I just go, wow, what is that? That is so cool. Can't help myself. So the way in which they are able to depict the machinery so lovingly, there's no other way to say it, is really impressive.
And yeah, Tom, why has it stuck with you this so long? And is it your, it's obviously you have a show about it, so it's kind of become your thing. But is this your number one thing? And is it something that you think you'll continue to watch until it ever ends, which it probably never will, from the sounds of it?
Well, I can't say it's my number one thing. I don't know that I have a number one thing, but the relationship I have to it, I can intellectualize about it. I can explain all kinds of wonderful things about it. I can go on for 200 episodes and counting about why I like Gundam. But at the end of the day, I saw something and my tiny brain exploded in fireworks. And I said, wow, that is a cool robot. And I was lost. I was lost forever.
Sometimes it is that simple, isn't it?
A cool robot. Absolutely.
Yeah. And cool robots are cool.
And do you both watch anime, or is this kind of the main anime you watch, or are you anime fans in general?
Definitely anime fans in general, though
Sweet.
We don't watch as much while we're in production as
Yeah.
we would have otherwise.
It's such a huge undertaking, and I think it's amazing. And I love that if people are, overwhelmed by the prospect of getting into Gundam, I recommend that you do give a listen to this show for sure, because it's probably a good companion piece. And I love the idea of that someone's going through, watching it for the first time as well, like with Nina. That's great. I think it's an awesome podcast, and I love that you guys are doing that.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it. It's been absolutely educational and fascinating. And I'm gonna dive into a couple of these. I think after Seed, I enjoyed that Seed movie. Like I say, very confused, but I was like, oh yeah, I could see this.
You said, wow, cool robot.
I did say wow, cool robot a few
Absolutely.
times actually. So it's Because and it's interesting you say about the sort of the turn off that people have with the old school animation, because one of my favorite shows of all time, animes in particular, but just shows full stop, is Legend of the Galactic Heroes.
Oh,
And
okay.
I am obsessed with it. And anyone who's listened to this podcast before is probably rolling their eyes.
I
Because
was just waiting for you to find a way to shoehorn it in.
It was always coming.
Yeah, and here we are.
Here we are. I waited till the end, in fairness.
You did.
But no, I just love it so much. And even the remake, which I started watching, I was like, even though once you sort of tune into the space battles in the, because it started in 1982, I think, Legend of Galactic Heroes, first season. And it's terrible, the animation. But it doesn't matter because the storytelling is so fantastic that I just forgive it all of its animation flaws. And then when they tried to sort of remake it in 2018, I was just like, but it's not the same. I couldn't get into it, which is a real shame because I love that story so much.
I think I'm a fan of older animation style as well, so it's not really a turn off for me. Like I think I'd rather go back and watch the original because I kind of that's how I feel too. It's such a it kind of gives it a level of like authenticity in my head. I know that obviously it's being made now and it is still authentic, but there's kind of like something about going back from the start and getting really attached to the original art styles and how it kind of grew from there. So. Yeah, I think I'm going to go back and watch it from the start.
Oh, we still have Boruto to watch, don't forget.
Yes, Boruto and all of Gundam.
Just a couple of undertakings.
Well, and the other great thing about that first Gundam series is if the whole 50-odd episodes is too much, there are the compilation movies.
Well, thank you both so much for taking the time to talk to us. It's been fantastic.
Thank you for having us.
Our absolute pleasure.
Not at all. So if you want to check out Mobile Suit Breakdown, where can they find you guys? What are your platforms?
We are GundamPodcast.com, and you can find links to all of our socials on there. We're also on YouTube, though it's not really what you would call a YouTube show. It's just the podcast audio with a static image.
We're also on basically all the podcast hosts, podcatchers, as Mobile Suit Breakdown.
Well, thank you so much once again for listening. If you like what we're doing, you can find us on Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube, where hopefully you're watching this podcast. But if you are listening on the audio platforms, you can give us a review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. If you really like what we're doing, you can find us on Patreon, where we do Patreon exclusive episodes for the top tiers, as well as early releases and behind the scenes footage. If you really like what we're doing, you can join for as little as $1.50 a month. We're a small independent operation, so every little bit does help. Thanks again, everyone. Always appreciate it.